We are going to talk about the jQuery Validate plugin. This plugin is used for form validation, and it makes validating your forms pretty easy. Uh, if you want to read documentation on it, I've included a link. You can also just go to that website and read through all of the different sections. I also have a couple of live demos you can play with. And I'm actually going to kind of walk through the code and show you how everything works and how the jQuery code connects back to your HTML. So taking a look at the HTML, you are going to include a link to the jQuery library, and this is a CDN. And you're also going to link to the validate CDN. And you'll notice that I have the jQuery library first, followed by the validate. Okay, and that's the order that you need to link them. Then in my form, you'll notice that I don't have any of the HTML5 validation attributes. So those validation attributes are things like required, maximum length, minimum length, all of that kind of thing. I didn't include any of that in this particular form. I also don't have any code to display errors. The other thing I want to point out, and this is actually really important with validate, is that it uses the name attribute. It's going to use the name attribute in your form tag. It will also use the name attribute in all of your input tags. Now, typically, name and ID are set to the same thing. And normally it's server-side code like PHP and that type of thing that use the name attribute. It's client-side code like jQuery and JavaScript typically use ID. This particular plugin is using the name attribute. Okay, I've just gotten in a habit of coding both and making them the same. So this is our form, pretty small and basic. You will notice at the very bottom is the link to my jQuery that includes the code for interacting with validate. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at that next. So the code for validate. So I put a lot of comments in here to help you guys out. But obviously, this is how you start all of your jQuery scripts. Because this is basically saying, wait until everything is loaded until you run through the script. Okay, then the selector that we're using is form, and we are specifying the name attribute, and it has to be set to registration. Now, why did I pick registration? I picked that because that is what the name attribute is set to. So whatever you set it to here, that needs to be what you're using here. And then you'll notice that we are calling validate. Okay, then validate requires rules, and it also requires messages. And so on the left-hand side, this is the name attribute of your input elements. So I got first name, last name, email, password. So the only thing I have for first name and last name is that they're required. For email, there is more than one thing. So you'll notice that I've got curly braces. So I've got required, true. And then I've got email, true. Okay, and you'll notice after email true, I don't put a comma because I put a comma after the curly brace. Because this is email, it will validate the email address. So we don't have to code all of the validation. It's part of this plugin, which is actually nice. Then for password, that also has two rules. So it's in curly braces, and you'll notice that it's required, and we have a minimum length of 5. This is the very last rule. So we're not putting a comma after the curly brace here. And this curly brace and comma go with the rules. Okay, so this is where it starts. This is where it ends. If I had additional rules after password, I would have to put a comma after the curly brace here. But because this is the last rule, no comma required. Okay, I just have to put a comma after the curly brace for this whole group of rules. Okay, then I'm going to specify the error messages that I want displayed if they submit and they haven't met the rules. So for first name, I only had one rule required. So I only have one message. For last name, I had one rule and I have one message. For password, I had 2 rules. Okay, so I have 2 messages. I have one message for each rule. So I have required, and here's required with the message, and then I have minimum length, and so there's a message for that. And for email, all I'm going to display is that they need to enter a valid email address. Okay, that's all I'm concerned about. And then you'll notice that we have the opening curly here, closing curly, and the comma. There is no comma after email because that is the last message. Then I have a submit handler, which is a function, and I'm pulling in all my form data, and it's going to submit my form. So you need to have this function, and you need to have form submit. What you don't have to have is the local storage. But I wanted to show you guys, if you wanted to save things to local storage, you still can do that. Okay, and this is where you would add that code. So you'll notice that this is my input element, first name ID. This is how you do it in jQuery, .val. So it's going to pull in that value. Input element, last name ID, .val. Okay, and then I'm throwing that stuff into local storage. So this is all the jQuery that I need for this form. So if I hit register and I haven't filled anything in, okay, this is what I'm getting. And so say I fill this in, and you'll see it as I'm typing, it actually goes away. And that's all part of this validate. Okay, so the minute I key something in wrong, I just did a comma instead of a period, validate realizes that is not a valid email address. So I have to fix it. And then for the password, if I don't make it 5 characters, I get the message. The minute it gets to 5, it's fine, and I can go ahead and hit register. And then it reroutes to my confirmation page, and it's pulling this from local storage. So that's how this is working in jQuery. And this example is showing you quite a few other form elements besides text boxes. So let's look at the code. So it kind of starts out at the top. Oh, and I should point out that the only difference in your CSS is that you're going to want to include form with an error class. And this is for the color of the error message that you get when you submit and you're missing something. Okay. Otherwise, this is all pretty straightforward CSS for forms. Looking here, you can see I've got the two CDN links. And for this particular form, I've set the name to preferences. And then looking at my drop-down list, I purposefully set the first one to nothing. Because if you don't do that, if you have something selected and you hit submit, it thinks that that's their choice. So let's say your first item was no preference. Okay, you submit, it's going to take no preference. So I had my first item be blank. That way it knows that they haven't chosen anything. Okay, so that was a design consideration when setting up this form. Okay, there is no HTML5 validation in here. Okay, so this is totally using whatever I've set up in jQuery as far as messaging and rules. Then looking down here, the checkboxes, because they're optional, they are something that I'm letting validate handle. So what I did was I set up 3 validation attributes. I've got required, minimum length is 1, which means they have to pick 1. Maximum length is 7, so they can't pick more than 7. Okay, and then as far as the input element here, obviously it's a checkbox. I've got an ID of hot weather, set a value to hot, but the name is set to an array because they can pick more than one. Okay, so as they make selections, what I believe Validate is doing is it's adding to an array. And it's making sure there's one thing in there. The minute there's more than 7, it's going to display an error message. Okay, and for alignment purposes, I stuck this in a table. And then you can see at the bottom below the table, I just threw a little label in here that says, please select at least one weather condition. So that's where, when I first load this, that's where that little message is coming from. But the minute I pick one and submit, it goes away. And so from this point on, it's going to be looking at jQuery. And if I do a submit on that, I can't do more than 7. Okay, now it's fine. If I get rid of all of these, it's saying it's required. That's coming from validate. Okay, so when I first load, the message is for me, but once I've submitted, okay, these messages come from validate. Okay, and specifically it's looking, even though I just have the rules on the very first checkbox, it's applying them to all of the checkboxes, and that is because I have the name set to an array. Okay, so that's how I handled checkboxes. I thought that was the easiest way to handle them. Terrain, as long as they pick something from the list, they're fine. And it's very interactive once they submit and there's an error. So if they do it correctly here and you submit, you know, you don't get the message. So you're not deselecting isn't going to display the message from validate until you submit. And then selecting and deselecting will display messages. And then for distance, this is something that I specified in jQuery, in my jQuery script. And so there is no validation for HTML in here. And the data list is, again, something that I'm validating through my script. So there is no HTML5 validation in here. And that brings me to the script. So this is super short. I didn't put as many comments in here, but you'll notice that this is the form element with the name attribute set to preferences. And then we've got dot validate. Now we've got the rules. And I did not include rules for weather, okay? Because I'm using the defaults in validate, and it's pulling from my HTML for that. Okay, so it's pulling these, and I'm just going with the default messages in validate. Okay, so I did set up rules for terrain, distance, and time. Very simple rules, just that they're required. And then down here for the messages, they're pretty generic little messages. And so you can see them if you submit without anything in there. And again, the messages that are now in the weather section, those are coming directly from validate. Okay, I'm not specifying these messages. Okay, so these are the only 3 that I set messages for. And I'm not doing the local storage on this, so the submit handler is pretty darn simple. I'm just basically submitting the form. And you will notice that up here in my form action, it does have the page that it's going to go to. So assuming they fill this out, and they submit, it takes them to this little thank you page. Okay, but that's basically how it works. Conceivably, you know, you could use all your HTML5 attributes, and then your jQuery would be pretty plain. In fact, you wouldn't really have rules or messages. You just have a submit handler. And you'd let validate handle everything. Most people like to specify some of their own error messages. Okay, but that is kind of an overview of how it works. And it is pretty slick. They have some examples at their site that you could take a look at as well. You can actually look through their code. I think it's at the bottom. Or maybe it's on the other page. Nope, it is on documentation. If you go down, if we take a look at here and you don't fill anything in, these are coming from the plugin as well. And you certainly can view the source code on those and kind of take a look at how they did it.